Hi everyone. I hope you've settled back into class and life after your spring break. I'm guessing that spring break didn't look very different from the rest of the year right now, but welcome back to class. This is just going to be a short video going over the midterm, just a few questions that people had trouble with, and then I'd like to dive in and talk about some of the essay questions because there were such great answers. I really enjoyed reading your answer to the essay questions, and I could tell that you all had a lot of fun with them too. It was a great chance to recap what we've learned, but also synthesize experience from your own lives, from our case studies, from the book, and from different readings, and to really think outside the box in tackling some of these bigger questions. So thank you all for doing such a great job. So let's spend a few minutes just touching on a few of the quick questions that some of you had a little trouble with. So the second from the top here, when taking cuttings, the soil medium should be bone dry. It in fact should be fairly moist. We're trying to encourage rooting pretty early on, and then of course as the cuttings are staying in there in the greenhouse or in the shade house, we in fact want almost constant mist on them. So that tripped a few people up a little bit. The next question that a few people had trouble with was the third one down here. All seed starting mixes contain nutrients for the baby starts. They in fact don't. So some people really prefer to use a sterile seeding mix, meaning there's no nutrition in there, or often meaning there's no nutrition in there for the seeds as they don't need it to germinate. And then once the cotyledons form, perhaps the first set of leaves is when people will really start fertilizing the plants. This is a little confusing because the jury is out. There's controversy about which kind of medium is best. Next, we'll take a look at the question at the top here. I can see how this might be a bit of a trick question. A few people had trouble on this. PVC is cheaper than metal conduit for hoop house construction and has no adverse, missing a D there, effects on greenhouse plastic. So it's both true and false, but the answer I was looking for was false. PVC is in fact cheaper than metal conduit, but a lot of people experience a degradation of their greenhouse plastic that is in contact with the PVC after a season or two. So this isn't, the most important point to consider when building a greenhouse or a hoop house, but it was in our reading, so I did want to touch on it. Now let's move on to the crux of the exam, the essay questions. I'm actually going to talk at length about the first question, so we'll skip that and come back to it. The second question was asking how you would make a greenhouse operation or a nursery business sustainable and what sustainability means to you. So I got a lot of great answers. Most of you touched on things such as IPM and water runoff and even gray water systems, and organic practices. And then some of you got really creative and also kind of dove into the idea of sustainability towards the community and towards the workers and towards you as an owner-operator. So someone said, you need to sustain the business and it needs to sustain you. I really loved that. I've shared some examples of farms and small businesses that just really are exploitative of their own labor more than even a worker's labor at times in the small growing situation. And so I loved that thought of a business is only going to be sustainable if you're able to keep doing it. The last question, this is where we thought about a small grower growing lettuce in California versus Michigan. This was a great way to think about production costs, first of all. So most of you touched on the fact that your costs were probably going to be a lot higher in Michigan. If you're trying to grow lettuce year-round, you're going to need a lot more heating and structures that allow heating to keep things alive during the winter. Whereas in California, you can probably string together a number of structures and shade houses in order to control the environment to grow your lettuce, but that those facilities won't be as cost prohibitive as in Michigan. Then a lot of you touched on the markets, so guessing that we would get a higher price for this lettuce here in California other than Michigan. and that we perhaps might have a longer season. So most people came out with the idea that California would be like slightly on top in terms of being a sustainable business and making more money more easily in growing lettuce, but that it was a tough call because there were lots of differences between the climate, the production costs, and the markets. So that was really fun to read through your answers and see where some of you took this question. So now I'd like to spend a few minutes thinking about the first essay question, and I'm going to share with you some really great creative answers from different people in the class. I wasn't necessarily looking for points for creativity. Many of you covered some basics, which is really important, but there were some cool answers that I thought the rest of you might like to hear. So the question was thinking about a small grower. And I didn't define this. So some of you define this as a small farm with greenhouses. Some of you define this as a greenhouse or nursery operation. It was a little bit broad. But the question was, what are some benefits of being a small grower in today's marketplace, and what are some challenges? The interesting thing is that since we took the midterm, we had the case study about Gilsum Gardens in New Hampshire, which is, of course, a really small producer. I mean, bigger than what I'm doing, but a small producer compared to the rest of the marketplace. So we saw a lot of this firsthand. So a lot of your answers were actually kind of foreshadowing what we later learned from Gilsum Gardens. So here are some answers to the first part, the benefits of being a small grower. And I will share this document in Canvas as well so that you all can take a look at it. So some people listed the benefits of being a small grower as integration of production and retail, i.e. value-added products like bouquets. I thought that was a great answer. A lot of you talked about the customer base. So support from customers who value local and sustainable products. Further touching on the customer base, the creation of a local, dependable customer base, creating brand loyalty and a secure market of people who believe in you, which bleeds into the next answer. The idea of education. You can interface with your customers more readily. They know you. You're not selling to a middleman who's then selling to your customer. You can talk about your products, what goes into the practice of growing them, and even why your customer needs these products. Next, we have overall adaptability. You can change your products, you can change your setup, you can move locations more on a whim based on the market or your own life. This is really getting at the idea that you can base your business around your personality, which of course has benefits and drawbacks, but it can definitely be seen as a pro of being a small grower. Next, we'll move on. I loved this answer because it touched on some of the case studies we've seen. So they can also capitalize on things like consultation, fertilizer production, or tourism. Skipping to the bottom of, we saw this in the article about shading from Bindweed Farm, how they could specialize in shade flowers, therefore carve out a niche. They also do consulting. I don't even know if we touched about this, but Bindweed is an example of the owners who go out and work with other farms. They also wrote a great book that I will find and share with you for kind of some additional reading. Some people mentioned the idea that a small grower might find it more easy to be sustainable, and they were therefore talking about the health of the soil and then the health of the ecosystem. But this person went beyond and talked about the improved health of people, of the workers, which I really appreciated that answer. Just a few more here, highlights from benefits of being a small grower. You're able to be more economic and utilize your time. One example would be making your own compost for soil. So we had a question like this in an earlier homework assignment too. You know, if you have more money for your startup costs or if you have more time, and the trade-offs of how you might approach your business differently. And making compost and making soil mixes was a popular answer back then too. You can build a relationship with our other local businesses, restaurants, and farms. You can pick up their used coffee grounds, veggie scraps, etc. I loved this answer. This was some interesting food for thought that I hadn't even thought of when creating this question. So small growers may be exempt from certain labor laws, regulations based on farm size. I see where you're going with this. I actually might leave out labor laws because that's a whole other that's a whole other ball of wax, you know. I guess I would say that I would support stringent labor laws, although of course I've seen it be problematic on small farms that are trying to run internships, and the internships are in fact prohibited. But really what the law is getting at is trying to move away from exploitative labor, and make sure that all farm workers have a say, are treated right with some standards. However, in some instances, there's someone who wants to volunteer or intern on a farm, and the farm might not accept them because of these labor laws, which are not in place to necessarily protect that person who is there by choice or for fun or whatever. But I would always fall on the side of supporting more stringent labor laws to protect the workers. However, this is not what this person was saying. This person probably agrees with me, but smaller farm size, you might not be on the radar, or you might not be big enough to catch the eye of laws that are not meant for you. And one example is that a nursery license. I applied for a nursery license for my farm, and I did still have to apply for it, but it doesn't charge me anything to have this license because I'm such a small farm. So they recognize that I'm so small, it's kind of not worth it. So that's the kind of thing this person was getting at. All right, let's dive into some challenges of being a small grower. This one was a little bit longer, so I broke it up into some different categories. So a lot of you touched on competition. So if you're a small grower, you face high competition from cheap imported crops, absolutely. Shifting markets due to unexpected events and competition. You guys talked about COVID and my business here, wedding flowers. Large companies can easily buy them out and take over their land. Yeah, absolutely. The larger companies will always dominate the market for the main staple crops. Yes. There's an inability to expand or compete on a larger level. It's a major shift between small scale and large scale, and difficult to make that work. So I forget which one of you gave this answer, but I believe you were drawing on your own experience of working on both small farms and large farms or nurseries, and just seeing how different that was. And it's not necessarily a smooth transition from one to the next, growing incrementally year by year. It's in fact a whole different ballgame. So then we move on to, of course, financing and money. Small growers may have a greater cost to income ratio, especially starting up their businesses as they enter the local marketplace and must carve out a niche to compete with the larger growers. Absolutely. Difficulty finding money up front to start up grow operations with equipment. Difficulty finding markets, having to go through middleman or wholesale. Larger profit, big farms have larger profit margins, which will provide for more transportation abilities that can travel farther, meaning more customers are reached. Absolutely. As a small producer, you can probably only reach the people in your immediate vicinity. I loved this answer, and this, in fact, is the key to a lot of these differences for me. Greenhouse operations, it's a scale economy, an economy of scale. The more you produce, the cheaper each unit is. Absolutely. Let's highlight that. Just a couple more things here. Mechanization. Larger farms have the means for automation, which will produce lower production costs with higher efficiency rates. We talk about this ad nauseum, so I think a lot of you touched on this. Someone mentioned ventilation systems that if they're not automated, there's a lot of human labor going into venting your greenhouse. We saw this in Gilsum Gardens. Automation becomes less useful on a smaller scale. It's necessary to compete with international growers, and businesses often operate on smaller margins, meaning they have less buffer in emergency. A lot of you touched on this idea of the buffer. Large farms have more staffing, which means more product sold more quickly. Larger farms get bigger government subsidies with better advertising opportunities. Whew. In the farming world, this drives me crazy, the subsidies that small farms can't get their hands on, or certain crops can't get their hands on. Logistics may be a challenge, especially if the terminal market is not local. I assume a larger grower would have this better dialed in. Absolutely. And someone else touched on transportation and trucking. Small growers have to find crops in their communities that fit their climate and geography. Absolutely. Here in Sonoma County, kind of 9B where I am, you better be growing and producing things that are going to thrive in people's home gardens. So thank you all. Again, I'll share this, and thanks for some great thoughtful answers in this exam.